There is a kind of courage that doesn't look like courage at all. It doesn't wear a uniform. It doesn't carry a weapon. It doesn't stand on a stage or ride into town on a horse while the crowd cheers. It looks like a woman crouching in the dirt at 4 in the morning, pressing her forehead against the neck of a sick goat, and whispering something you weren't meant to hear. It looks like 4 crumpled dollar bills folded into a shirt pocket. All she had, all she risked, all she bet on a future that everyone around her had already surrendered. I've reported from war zones. I've sat inside military hospitals with men who'd lost limbs and were still cracking jokes. I've stood at the edges of flooded towns and watched families carry what they could in plastic buckets. I thought I understood what endurance looked like. I was wrong. This story begins in the summer of 2012, in a part of the Texas borderland so dry the earth had cracked into tiles like old bathroom floor. It begins with a woman named Esperanza Ciende, half Apache, half something the land itself seemed to claim, and 55 goats so thin you could count their ribs from 20 yards. It ends somewhere I did not expect. I need you to understand something before we start. I didn't go there to write about her. I went because my editor sent me to file a drought story, something visual, something with numbers, acreage lost, livestock dead, economic figures, a quote from a county extension agent. I found all of that. I also found the most quietly extraordinary thing I've ever witnessed, and I've spent the better part of 20 years trying to figure out how to write it without diminishing it. What follows is my best attempt. The smell hit me first. Not the smell of goats, though that was present too, musky and warm and faintly mineral, like wet stone. What I mean is the larger smell of the land itself, scorched mesquite and baked caliche and the specific odor of things that have been dry for too long. It's a smell that gets into your throat. It stays. I'd been driving since before sunrise, following directions that kept sending me down roads that weren't on any map I owned, until my truck's tires were kicking up pale dust in rooster tails, and the GPS had given up entirely and was showing me a blank gray screen with a blinking cursor like a frustrated typewriter. My notebook was open on the passenger seat. I had a pencil tucked behind my ear. I still use pencils, always have. Something about the permanence of ink makes me nervous when the story isn't finished yet. My coffee had gone cold somewhere back around Terlingua. The gate was a piece of rebar bent into a loop, draped over a cedar post. No sign, no mailbox. Just a track running off into the brush that might have been a road and might have been a dry wash. Impossible to tell at dawn. I sat there for a moment, engine idling. I had a name written in my notebook. Esperanza Ciende. County record had listed her as the registered owner of a parcel of grazing land, 43 acres in the river Drought, current assessed value. Depressed. The county extension agent, a tired man named Hector Villarreal who seemed to be carrying the weight of the entire drought personally, had mentioned her almost as an afterthought. "There's a woman out east of the river," he'd said, stirring his coffee without looking at it. "Apache blood, got some goats. I don't know what she's doing out there, to be honest with you. The land's no good right now. Nobody's land is any good right now." He'd paused. "She's not the type that gives up easy, is all I know." I'd written that down, not the type that gives up easy. Then I'd driven for an hour and a half in the dark. I turned in through the rebar gate. The goats were in a pen made of salvaged wood and wire fencing, set against the east side of a small rise that offered maybe 40 feet of morning shade. There were more of them than I expected. They were jammed together in that communal way animals do when they're conserving warmth or simply exhausted, shoulders touching, heads low. Some had their eyes open. Some didn't. I counted while I sat in the truck, motor off now, window down to catch whatever breeze existed. 54, 55. Maybe more, it was hard to tell in the penned mass. They were predominantly boar crosses and Spanish brush goats, the colors ranging from white to fawn to a deep mahogany brown that looked almost black in the early light. They were thin in the way that takes a while to register. Your eye expects an animal to have a certain fullness, and when it doesn't, there's a moment of cognitive delay before you understand what you're seeing. These goats had been thin for a long time. I got out of the truck slowly, the way you move in a strange place when you're not sure what you're walking into. The air was already warming. It wasn't yet 7 in the morning, and I could feel the heat building like a tide coming in. She was around the back of the shed. I heard her before I saw her, a low, steady sound that I initially took for humming but wasn't quite. It was something halfway between a hum and a spoken word, rhythmic and purposeful, the kind of sound that belongs in a ceremony or a lullaby or some space between the two. I followed it around the corner of the shed and stopped. She was kneeling in the dirt beside a goat that had collapsed near the water trough. The goat was down on its side, legs extended, breathing in the labored way I recognized from enough animal situations to know was serious. She had one hand on the goat's neck and the other pressed flat to its ribs, feeling the breath, and she was doing that sound, that halfway between humming and words thing, without looking up. She knew I was there. I could tell by the slight adjustment of her shoulders, the way she didn't startle. She just kept doing what she was doing. I stood and waited. She was somewhere between 40 and 60, though I've learned not to trust my guesses in that range with people who have spent most of their lives outdoors. Her hair was black going silver, pulled back without ceremony. She was wearing a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, jeans worn to the color of old bone at the knees, boots that had given everything they had over many years and were still giving. Her hands were remarkable, wide-palmed, long-fingered, competent in the way of hands that have never had the luxury of being decorative. The goat breathed. She pressed her palm to its ribs and said something quietly in a language I didn't speak. Then she looked up at me. "You're the reporter," she said. "Yes, ma'am, Caleb Morse," I called ahead. She looked back at the goat. "I remember, help me get her up." I came forward and did what she indicated, positioned myself at the hindquarters, steadying while she lifted and supported from the shoulder, and together we got the goat standing, swaying, confused. She held it for a moment. It steadied. She released it slowly, and it walked 3 unsteady steps to the trough and dropped its muzzle into the water. "Good," Esperanza said quietly. She wiped her hands on her jeans and stood and looked at me with a directness that made me feel very specifically like a person who had arrived at a complicated time. "You want to know about the drought," she said. "I do, and about the goats." "They're the same thing," she said. She gave me coffee from a dented aluminum pot on a propane burner inside the shed, which served as a combination storage space, equipment room, and something between a kitchen and a living area. There was a cot against one wall with a military-style wool blanket folded at the foot, a shelf of canning jars, a radio, a photograph thumbtacked to a board above the work table, 2 people I didn't ask about yet. We sat on overturned buckets outside the shed door, and she talked, slowly at first, choosing words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. The goats had come to her in February of that year, February 2012, when the drought that had technically started the previous summer was revealing its true character. She'd gotten a call from a man she knew slightly, a livestock broker named Dade, who was liquidating a herd for a family outside Pico's that couldn't hold on anymore. The family was selling everything. They needed to move fast. The animals were too thin to get market rate. "How much?" she'd asked. "$1.50 a head if you take the lot," Dade had said. "Otherwise, I'm calling the rendering company." 55 goats at $1.50 came to $82.50. She had $4 in her account. I looked at her, she looked at her coffee. "I asked Dade to hold them 3 days, she said. In those 3 days, she did the following. Sold a silver bracelet she'd inherited from her mother for $30 to a pawn shop in Presidio. Traded 12 jars of canned peppers she'd put up the previous fall for a favor owed by a neighboring rancher, which settled a debt for a part she'd borrowed from his equipment and never properly repaid, which freed her to sell that piece of equipment, a functioning but elderly hay elevator, for $50 to a man in Marfa who'd been asking about it for 2 years. And she convinced Dade to extend her terms. She'd pay him the $78.50 balance within 60 days. She picked up the goats on a morning when the temperature was already at 92 degrees by 9 a.m. "They were worse than I expected," she told me, looking at the pen now where the herd was beginning to move slowly in the warming light, spreading out, grazing at the sparse brush along the fence line. "The family, they'd been trying to feed them until they couldn't anymore. That's the worst kind of situation, when people care and still can't do it. The animals aren't neglected out of cruelty. They're neglected out of failure. You can see the difference." I wrote that down. She noticed me writing and said nothing about it, which I took as permission to continue. "What made you buy them?" I asked, knowing the drought was only getting worse. She was quiet for a moment. "Because Dade was going to call the rendering company," she said. "That's it." She turned to look at me, and for the first time I felt the full weight of her attention, which was not comfortable exactly, but was clarifying. "That's it," she said. "You don't always get to wait for a good reason." The 60 days she'd promised Dade passed. She paid him with money she'd made from the goats themselves, not from selling them, but from their milk. This is where the story turns, or begins to turn, the way a river bends underground before you see the canyon it made. 3 weeks after she'd gotten the herd, a neighbor's teenage daughter came by with a mason jar asking if she had any fresh milk. The girl's mother had a stomach condition. She couldn't process cow's milk anymore, but goat's milk sat different, gentler, and the nearest source was 40 miles away, and the family didn't have the gas money. Esperanza had given her the milk and thought nothing of it. Then the girl came back. Then her cousin came. Then a woman from the Mexican side of the draw sent her husband with a 2-gallon jug and an embarrassed expression and $14 in folded bills. She hadn't advertised, she hadn't priced it. She'd given milk away when she had it, and accepted what was offered when it was offered, and within a month there was something happening that she hadn't planned and couldn't quite explain. People were coming to her. The drought had killed or compromised almost every source of fresh dairy within a 2-county radius. The commercial operations had pulled back or suspended. Feed costs had tripled. Livestock auctions were running at 1,000 animals a week, and prices were still falling because nobody had water and nobody had grass, and nobody could afford to keep animals they couldn't feed. Except that Esperanza's goats, who had arrived thin and half-dead from neglect, were beginning to be different. She'd understood something about them that I didn't understand until she explained it to me, standing at the fence of the pen while the herd moved in the growing morning heat. Spanish brush goats, the foundation stock of most of these animals, were not dairy animals in the commercial sense. They were survival animals. They had been shaped over centuries of selection, not by ranchers making breeding decisions, but by the land itself. The animals that had survived the semi-arid rangeland of northern Mexico and the Texas borderland were the ones that could find nutrition in brush, cactus pads, coarse forbs, dried stems. They had adapted to drought the way the land had adapted to drought, by becoming minimal, efficient, and hard. A Holstein on a dry range will die. These goats thinned and kept walking. They didn't produce much milk, nothing like the output of a managed dairy animal, but they produced some, reliably, even on poor range. And that small, reliable output had become, in the context of a landscape where every other source had collapsed, extraordinary. The milk didn't change, Esperanza said. The world around it did. By June, she was running a kind of informal exchange out of the shed, milk for labor, milk for goods, occasionally milk for cash when cash was what someone had. She had no refrigeration beyond an old chest cooler she kept iced with blocks she drove 30 miles to buy. She was milking twice a day, every day, in temperatures that climbed above 100 by early afternoon. I asked her how many hours a day she was working. She considered the question like it was slightly absurd. "All of them," she said. She wasn't exaggerating by much. She was up before 4. She was working until dark. She slept in the shed on the cot on the nights she was too tired to make it to the house. A small adobe structure set back in the brush 200 yards from the pen, which I wouldn't see until the second day I was there. She was doing this alone. I asked about family. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the photograph above the work table that I'd noticed when she poured the coffee. "My son," she said, "he's in the army." "Your husband?" "Not here," she said, in a tone that closed that door without locking it. I didn't push. My pencil hovered over the notebook, and I made a small mark, a habit I developed early, marking things I wanted to return to, things I sensed were load-bearing but too fragile to touch yet. There were several of those marks in my notebook by the end of that first morning. Noon came and the heat became something you could almost feel as a physical pressure, like a hand pressing down. The goats had retreated to the shade of the shed's east wall, pressed together again, conserving. Esperanza moved among them without urgency, pausing at each one, checking something, condition, alertness, and injury she was monitoring. She touched each animal briefly, nothing demonstrative, just contact. Recognition. I watched her stop at the goat that had been down that morning, the one we'd helped to its feet. She crouched and put her hand on its shoulder, said something, moved on. I'd been watching people work my whole career. I'd watched surgeons and soldiers and farmers and engineers, and I'd learned to read the difference between competence and love. What she had with these animals was both, braided together in a way that made them indistinguishable. "How many have you lost?" I asked when she came back and we shared the remainder of the coffee, gone cold and thick. 11, she said, since February. "How many do you expect to lose before fall?" She looked at the sky, which was the color of bleached denim, cloudless in every direction. "That depends on things I can't control," she said. Like rains. Like rain and other things. The other things I would learn were more complicated than weather. There were neighbors who'd started asking questions about what she was doing, whether it was licensed, whether it was sanitary, whether she had permits. There was the small reality that her land, 43 acres, was not enough for 55 goats in a drought. She'd been supplementing with purchased feed, which was costing money she didn't have, which meant she was spending the milk revenue almost as fast as it came in. There was the physical reality of a 61-year-old woman. She told me her age eventually, in the same matter-of-fact way she told me everything, doing work designed for 2 people, alone, in 100-plus-degree heat. And there was something else she mentioned, quietly, in the last half hour before I left for the day to drive back to Presidio and find a motel with a functioning air conditioner. She'd had a conversation with Hector Villarreal, the extension agent. He'd come out 2 weeks earlier to check on a water situation. While he was there, he'd mentioned, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news that isn't quite his to deliver, that the county was getting pressure from the state agricultural board. There were regulations about commercial milk operations, permits, inspections, minimum standards. She wasn't commercial, she wasn't selling. She was sharing, exchanging, giving. But the line, Hector had said gently, could be interpreted differently by different people. "What did you say to him?" I asked. She looked at me with that direct, clarifying gaze. "I said I'd worry about it when someone made me worry about it," she said. "Right now I've got goats to milk." I drove back to Presidio with the windows down and the warm night air coming through the cab, and I made notes at a gas station under a buzzing light while moths circled my head, and I thought about what she'd said. You don't always get to wait for a good reason. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about 11 goats, about $4, about the sound she'd made in the dirt, the one that was halfway between a hum and a word when she thought no one was listening. I came back the next morning before 6. She was already in the pen. I don't know what I'd expected, maybe that the previous day's conversation had been the whole story, that I'd gotten what I needed and could write my drought piece and move on. Instead, I found myself parking the truck at the rebar gate in the dark and sitting there for a moment with the engine off, listening to the silence of the land, which wasn't silence at all. Insects, a distant owl, the soft percussion of hooves on packed dirt. I have a habit, I mentioned it, the pencil behind the ear, and I have another habit that I don't mention as often because it sounds worse than it is. I talk to myself in the truck. Not continuously, not in sentences exactly, more in fragments, observations, things I'm trying to work out. My ex-wife called it rehearsing. She wasn't wrong. In the dark before 6 a.m., parked at a rebar gate in the Texas borderland, I told myself, this is more than a drought piece. Then I got out of the truck. She had me working within 20 minutes of my arrival, which I suspect was her way of evaluating me and also her way of simply getting things done. She handed me a bucket and pointed me toward the water trough that needed topping off from the tank. While I did that, she started the morning milking, a process I'd observed from a distance the previous day, but hadn't been close enough to see properly. She milked by hand. She didn't have equipment for anything else, and the volume from each animal, some days a quart, some days less, from the better producers occasionally approaching a half-gallon, didn't justify the expense even if she'd had it. She worked methodically, setting a 3-legged stool beside each animal in turn, speaking to it quietly before beginning, her hands moving with the economy of motion that comes from 10,000 repetitions. I filled the trough and watched. "How long have you been milking goats?" I asked. "Since I was 7, she said without stopping. "My grandmother kept goats." "Where?" "Here, different parcel, closer to the river." A pause. The river wasn't what it is now. She didn't say what it was now, but I'd driven across the bridge the previous afternoon and seen what she meant. The river was a series of pools connected by wet sand, the water moving if you watched it carefully enough. the banks chalked with salt deposits from evaporation, the cottonwoods along its edge brown in midsummer where they should have been green. "Your grandmother taught you?" I asked. "She didn't teach, she worked and I watched and then I did it." She moved to the next animal, repositioned the stool, began again. "There's a difference. I've interviewed a lot of people who say things like this and mean them in a vaguely philosophical way, a self-mythologizing way. She said it as a statement of fact. There was no philosophy in it. Watching and doing were the same thing, and teaching was something that happened between them without anyone declaring it." I wrote it down. By 8:30, we'd finished the milking, and I'd helped her carry the containers, a mix of repurposed commercial pails and mason jars, and one proper stainless steel dairy bucket that was clearly the veteran of serious use, to the shed, where she strained and stored them in the chest cooler. The yield that morning was approximately 14 quarts from the 22 animals currently in milk. Not all of the herd was lactating. Several were dry, several were too young, 2 were males kept for future breeding purposes. 14 quarts. I'd been trying to calculate, roughly, what the market value of this would be in a normal year. Specialty goat milk, organic certified, ran $3 to $5 a quart retail. 14 quarts retail value, somewhere between $42 and $70 a day. Except nothing about this was retail. She was working 60-plus-hour weeks in 100-degree heat, spending most of what she took in on feed and ice and equipment maintenance, and living on almost nothing. "Do you eat?" I asked her later bluntly. She looked at me. "I mean, do you take care of yourself? Are you eating enough, sleeping enough?" A small pause. "I eat," she said. That's not an answer to the second part. She almost smiled. "No," she agreed, "it isn't." She made a breakfast, scrambled eggs from the 6 chickens she kept behind the adobe flour tortillas from the previous day, coffee, that she divided between us without comment. I ate my portion, and then, when she turned away to check on something, I left mine on the makeshift table. When she came back, she looked at the plate and looked at me. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," I said. She ate it. The visitors started, arriving around 10. First was a woman named Carmen who came on foot from a property I couldn't see, maybe a half-mile through the brush, carrying 2 empty mason jars and a baby on her hip. She was younger than Esperanza by 20 years at least, moving with the careful energy of a person running on not quite enough rest. She and Esperanza spoke in a mix of Spanish and English, quick and comfortable, the kind of exchange between people who have known each other long enough to stop performing communication. Carmen's baby, 6 months old, named Isidro, round-faced and serious, watching me from his mother's hip with great professional suspicion, had been having trouble with formula. The cost had gone up. The specific brand he'd tolerated had been unavailable at the nearest store for 3 weeks. The goat's milk, diluted according to Esperanza's instruction and supplemented with other nutrients, had been what he'd been drinking for the past 2 weeks. Carmen filled her 2 jars and tucked them into a cloth bag she wore across her chest. She offered money. Esperanza declined it with a gesture. Carmen said something quietly in Spanish that I didn't catch fully, but that sounded, in tone, like an argument she already knew she'd lose. Esperanza said something back. Carmen looked at the baby, looked at Esperanza, nodded once and turned and walked back into the brush. I watched her go. The baby watched me go until he was screened by the mesquite. "She doesn't take charity easily," Esperanza said, coming to stand beside me. "Neither do you," I said. She considered that. "No," she agreed. After Carmen came an elderly man named Mr. Beaumont, who arrived in a truck older than my father would be if my father were still alive, driving slowly enough that I heard him coming a full 3 minutes before he pulled up. He was Anglo, maybe 80, wearing a straw hat that had been through so many seasons it was more concept than object. He got out with the deliberate movements of a man whose body has strong opinions about getting out of trucks. He and Esperanza exchanged a greeting that involved, as far as I could tell, nothing resembling warmth, and yet communicated a fundamental mutual regard that was warmer than warmth. She went inside and came out with a jar she'd set aside and handed it to him. He accepted it, opened his truck door, placed it with great care on the passenger seat. Then he turned to me. "You're writing about this," he said. "Yes, sir." "Good," he said. He said nothing else, got back in the truck, drove away at the same measured pace. I looked at Esperanza. Who is he? He's been ranching that section north of here for 50 years, she said. His wife had a stroke in April. She can't have a lot of foods anymore. Goat's milk cheese is one of the things she can have. You're making cheese. Some days, she said, when there's enough. Here is what I want to tell you about Esperanza Ciende, or the part of it I understood by the end of the second day. She had not set out to become necessary. She had not purchased those 55 goats with a plan, a vision, a mission statement. She had bought them because they were going to die, and she had $4 and the capacity to imagine that $4 differently than anyone else around her. What happened after that? The milk exchange, the informal network, the small ecosystem of need and provision that had formed around her shed and her cooler and her bucket, was not something she designed. It had arrived, the way things arrive when a person creates a certain kind of gravity by simply not stopping. But it was costing her. I saw the medication on the shelf above the cot in the shed on the second afternoon when I went in to get my notebook from where I'd left it. I wasn't snooping. It was in plain sight, a prescription bottle alongside a tube of something, neither of which I could identify from across the room. I didn't look closely. I filed it in the back of my awareness the way I file things I'm not ready to ask about. That evening, when the heat had gone from brutal to merely punishing, and we were sitting outside the shed again in the last of the direct light, she told me without my asking. I have a heart condition, she said. Nothing dramatic, managed, but I need to be careful with the heat. I was quiet for a moment. You're working 14-hour days in 100-degree weather, I said. I told you managed. That doesn't sound. It's managed, she said, with a firmness that was not anger. It was the firmness of someone who has had this conversation with themselves many times and has arrived at the same place each time. I know what I'm doing. I thought about Carmen's baby, about Mr. Beaumont's careful placement of the jar on the passenger seat, about the 11 goats she'd lost and the 44 she hadn't. What happens if you can't do this? I asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. What happens to the people who are depending on the milk? She looked at the land for a long time. The light was going orange, the brush casting long purple shadows, the distant hills going the color of rust. That's not a reason to stop, she said finally. That's a reason to keep going. I turned that sentence over in my mind for a long time. I'm still turning it. The decision I watched her make that second afternoon was not dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, the way the most important decisions usually do, embedded in a practical conversation about something else. A rancher named Fowler came out from town. I'd see him for only a few minutes. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s with the sunburned caution of someone who spent decades not saying more than he needed to. He had a proposition. He had acreage, 2 sections east of her property, currently ungrazed because his cattle were too expensive to move and too many to feed. The land was poor, but it was land, and poor grazing land in a drought was still better than no grazing land. He was offering her access. In exchange for what, I didn't quite catch. It seemed less like an exchange and more like a gesture wrapped in the language of an exchange, so that she could accept it without feeling the weight of charity. She heard him out. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You'll let me run the whole herd over there in the next 3 weeks." "Most of it," he said. "East section's the better one right now." "I'll lose some," she said. "Moving them in this heat, in this condition, some won't make it." "Some might not make it anyway," he said. She looked at the herd in the pen. The arithmetic of that, the animals she'd lose to the move versus the animals she'd lose to standing still, to a land that had given everything it had and had nothing left, was visible on her face in a way she wasn't trying to hide. "Okay," she said. Fowler nodded. That was the extent of it. He left. She stood at the fence for a while after he drove off. I stood near her, not close, giving her the space you give someone who is doing math with their heart. "How many will you lose?" I asked eventually. "2," she said, "maybe 3. "How many will you save?" She didn't answer that immediately. When she did, her voice was steady. "More than 2, she said. That was the decision, made in the same tone she'd used to tell you the morning milking yield. No drama, no visible anguish, just the calculation done honestly, and then the acceptance of what the calculation said. I've watched people make decisions under pressure my whole career. I know the difference between courage and resignation, between sacrifice and surrender. What she did at that fence wasn't any of those things, or it was all of them at once, compressed into something that didn't have a name I'd ever learned. I wrote more than two and underlined it, and didn't write anything else for a while. That night, the first real clouds in 3 months drifted in from the south. They didn't produce rain. They just sat there in the night sky, lit from below by the absent moon, enormous and still and theatrical, like scenery someone had hung up to give the land a break from its own nakedness. I stood outside the shed. She'd told me I could sleep on the floor if I wanted rather than drive back to Presidio, and I'd taken her up on it with more gratitude than I'd admitted, and looked at the clouds and thought about $4. About what $4 can do when it's spent by the right person at the right moment. About 11 dead goats and 44 living ones. About Carmen's baby, watching me with professional suspicion. About Mr. Beaumont, putting the jar on the seat like he was buckling in a child. I went back inside and lay down on my sleeping bag on the shed floor and listened to the goats shifting in the pen outside, their occasional soft sounds, the small percussion of their presence. Before I fell asleep, I made a note in my notebook, in the dark, by feel, she didn't buy them to save them. She bought them because someone had to. I thought that was the story. I was only partway right. The clouds were gone by morning. I woke to the same dry, pale light I'd woken to every morning for as long as I'd been in the borderland, and I lay on the shed floor for a moment with my hands behind my head and looked at the corrugated metal ceiling and listened to Esperanza already moving in the pen outside, and I thought, of course. Of course the clouds hadn't produced rain. This land was not going to let a good story get too easy. I'd been there 4 days by this point. I'd called my editor twice, brief, functional calls. Yes, I'm still here. Yes, there's a story, give me more time, and he'd given me more time because I could hear in my voice that there was something there, and he'd been doing this long enough to trust that signal. I'd been sleeping in the shed. I'd been waking before 6. I'd been helping with the morning milking and filling water troughs, and doing whatever was needed in the way that you do when you've crossed some invisible line from observer to participant, and can't quite pinpoint the moment it happened. She hadn't asked me to stay. She hadn't told me to leave. She'd simply continued doing what she was doing, and I'd continued following. The move happened on day 5. Fowler had arranged for 2 of his hands to help, which in practice meant 3 additional humans and 1 good stock dog. A blue heeler named, apparently, Potato, who was worth more than all 3 humans combined when it came to managing the goat's direction of travel. Moving 52 animals, 3 had been separated out as too weak to travel, kept in the pen with a neighbor's daughter to check on them. Across approximately 1.5 miles of rangeland in the early morning heat before the worst of the day arrived, was an exercise in controlled chaos that I recorded in my notebook with the frantic shorthand I use when things are happening faster than full sentences allow. Dust, the goats moved in a way that was not quite a herd and not quite a rabble, flowing around obstacles, splitting and rejoining, finding routes through brush that no one had asked them to find. Potato worked the edges with precision and economy, barely barking, using body movement the way a good speaker uses silence. Esperanza walked near the front. She didn't run, didn't shout, moved at a pace that the animals seemed to organize themselves around, a calm center that the chaos referenced. One of Fowler's hands, a young man, maybe 22, who'd introduced himself as Lewis and then not said anything else, ranged out wide on the right flank. The other, older, quieter, stayed near the back. I stationed myself somewhere in the middle and tried not to be in the way and was mostly in the way. 40 minutes in, on a rocky stretch where the trail dipped between 2 caliche ridges, 3 of the animals broke left and went up the ridge toward brush that was more vertical than horizontal and thoroughly uninviting. Lewis went after them without being told, angling up the ridge in a way that suggested he'd done this enough times that it had become geometry rather than effort. He turned them. They came back down. 52 went in. 51 arrived at the east section. She found the one that didn't make it, an older doe, one of the original 55, a fawn-colored animal with a torn ear that I'd noticed Esperanza checking on every morning about 40 yards off the trail in the shade of a creosote bush. She'd laid down and her heart had simply stopped, as best anyone could tell. She hadn't been in obvious distress. She'd just been done. Esperanza stood over her for a moment. Lewis, on the other hand, kept moving the rest of the herd toward the east section. They understood without being told that this was a private moment. Potato sat down near Esperanza and put his nose to his paws. I stood 20 feet back. She crouched and put her hand on the goat's shoulder, the same gesture I'd seen her make with the living animals 100 times, that brief recognition, that contact. She stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds. Then she stood and turned and kept walking. She didn't say anything about it for the rest of the day. That evening, after the herd was settled in the east section, moving slowly through the brush there, which was genuinely better, fuller, the animals pulling at it with something that looked almost like appetite. She sat on a rock at the edge of the pasture, and I sat near her, and we watched the light go out of the sky, and she said, without preamble, 41 years ago, my grandmother lost her whole herd in a freeze, all of them, 17 animals. She was quiet for 3 days, and then she got 2 animals from a neighbor and started again. I waited. I used to think that was just stubbornness, she said. And now I think it was something else, she said. I don't have a word for it in English. What's the word in? She said something in Apache that I can't reproduce in writing, a word with a fricative beginning and a falling second syllable, something that sounded like it had texture. What does it mean? I asked. She thought for a moment. It means the part of you that keeps growing in the direction of the sun, even when there is no sun. I called my editor that night from the truck, parked in a spot where the signal was strong enough to hold a conversation. How big is it? He asked. I don't know yet, I said. Give me something. A woman bought 55 dying goats for $4 because they were going to die. Now she's the only source of milk in a 2-county area, and she's doing it alone with a heart condition, and she just lost another one and she keeps going. Silence. That's the story, he said. That's the beginning of the story, I said. 3 weeks after the move, the regulatory notice arrived. I wasn't there when it came. I'd gone back to El Paso to file my preliminary piece and come back. The notice was from the Texas Department of Agriculture, 2 pages, formal, citing the specific statutes about unlicensed commercial dairy operations. Someone had filed a complaint. The notice required her to either register as a licensed dairy operation, with all accompanying inspections and facility requirements, or cease distribution of milk products. She showed me the papers when I returned, without apparent alarm, spreading them on the workbench in the shed. What are you going to do? I asked. I've already done it, she said. She'd called Hector Villarreal the day she received the notice. He'd called someone at the extension office. That someone had called a woman at the Sustainable Agriculture Department at Texas A&M who'd been tracking drought relief food networks across the state and was looking for examples. That woman had called a lawyer in Austin who did agricultural nonprofit work. The lawyer, a woman named Sandra who communicated primarily through rapid, dense emails, had identified a specific exemption in the Texas Agriculture Code for what she termed community herd share programs, a legal arrangement where participants technically own a share of the herd and receive a portion of its production in exchange, bypassing the commercial dairy licensing requirements. Setting it up required paperwork. It required some money. Sandra was doing it at reduced rate, but not free. It required Esperanza to have documentation she'd never organized because she'd never operated as anything other than someone who did what needed doing. For 3 weeks, while managing 51 goats on 2 parcels of land in the remnants of a brutal drought, she did the paperwork. How, I asked when she told me all of this, when did you have time? She gestured at the cot. Nights, she said. The herd share program went legal in September, 6 weeks before the drought began its long, incomplete retreat, partial rains coming in October, enough to green the creosote and give the land a temporary truce, but not enough to fill the tanks or rest the range or make anyone relax. By that point, she had 37 participants in the program. 37 families, households, individuals, holding legal shares in a herd of 51 goats on 43 acres plus borrowed east section, receiving milk, cheese on the weeks there was enough, occasionally cream in exchange for their share fee, which she'd set at an amount that covered her costs and no more, a number she'd calculated with Sandra's help, and then reduced by 8% because she felt she'd originally set it slightly too high. I asked her how she'd arrived at that 8%. She showed me a legal pad covered in her handwriting, numbers, crossed-out numbers, notes, margins filled with calculations. I wanted it to be fair, she said. Not profitable, fair. In October, I drove back one last time before I filed the full piece. The land was marginally better. The creosote had greened. There was actual grass coming up in the east section, and the river, when I crossed the bridge, had water moving in it with something approaching intention. Esperanza was at the fence of the pen when I arrived, watching the herd. The goats were different, not dramatically, not in the way of a transformation scene in a movie. Differently in the way of things that have come through something long and hard and are on the other side of it, changed not by any single moment but by accumulated endurance. Their ribs were less obvious. They moved with more intention. She was different, too. I'd been watching her long enough by this point to see things that had been there all along, but that I'd had to earn the vision to observe. The way she stood at the fence, arms folded across the top rail, weight slightly forward, was the posture of someone who is watching something they have a stake in. Not anxiety, investment. She'd lost 9 goats total over the summer. 46 remained of the original 55. 2 new kids had been born in August, against all expectation, small and wild-eyed and aggressively alive. What happens now? I asked. The range needs another year, she said. Maybe 2. The program continues. In spring, we'll look at expanding. Expanding, more goats. More participants, she said. There are families in the next county. I looked at her, she looked at the herd. You could charge more, I said, for the milk. With the herd share legal, with the network you have, you could actually generate income. She was quiet for a moment. I do generate income, she said. It covers costs. I mean beyond costs. She turned to look at me with an expression I'd seen a few times before, not impatience, not dismissal, but the look of someone observing a fundamental misunderstanding. The point isn't beyond costs, she said. I've thought about that sentence for a long time. I've written about people who have done extraordinary things for extraordinary reasons, for glory, for history, for ideology, for revenge, for love of the cleaner, more dramatic kind. I've written about sacrifice that announced itself and courage that came with a speech. Esperanza Ciende bought 55 dying goats with $4 and a borrowed 60-day promise, and worked herself toward her own limits all summer in heat that should have broken her. And she did it not for history or glory or even for the clean narrative of redemption. She did it because the point wasn't beyond costs. Because Carmen's baby needed milk. Because Mr. Beaumont's wife needed something she could eat. Because 11 animals died and 44 didn't and 2 were born against expectation, and the difference between those numbers is a woman who showed up before 6 in the morning and kept showing up. On my last afternoon there, in October, the sky did something I hadn't seen it do in 5 days of visits over 5 months. It clouded over, real clouds, gray-bellied, moving. The temperature dropped 8 degrees in an hour. The smell of the land changed, that specific, irreplaceable smell that comes before rain, petrichor, and warm earth and something electrical, the olfactory fact of water arriving. The goats knew before we did. They came alert all at once in the way animals do when the world is about to change. Heads up, ears forward. 51 animals standing in the same direction, faces turned to the incoming weather, and then the first drops came, widely spaced at first, speckling the pale dust, and the goats moved, not running, not panicking, just reorienting, repositioning, turning into the rain with what I can only describe as gladness, some fundamental animal gladness at the return of what they needed. Esperanza stood at the fence with her face up. I stood beside her. The rain came heavier then, and she let it, eyes closed, arms down at her sides, not dramatic about it, just receiving it, the way you receive something you've been patient enough to wait for. I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. After a while, she opened her eyes and looked at the herd and said quietly, more to herself than to me, "There you go." I filed the story in November. It ran as a full feature, longer than my editor originally wanted, illustrated with photographs a colleague shot on a return visit when I couldn't get back myself. It got a decent response. A number of emails, a few calls, one from an agricultural nonprofit in Dallas that reached out to Esperanza directly. I don't know what came of that. I've made a few calls over the years, gotten a few updates through Hector Villarreal, who seems to function as an informal news service for the entire county extension region. The herd is larger now, last I heard. The herd share program has participants in 3 counties. The east section has been formalized into a grazing lease. Her son came home from the army. I don't know more than that, and I'm not sure I need to. What I know is that I drove into the borderland to write about a drought, and came back with something I didn't have words for then, and don't have perfect words for now. Something about what a person can do with almost nothing when they don't wait for the conditions to improve before they begin. When I hear people talk about big gestures, the dramatic sacrifice, the announced commitment, the publicly visible act of courage, I think about a woman crouching in the dirt at 4 in the morning with her palm against a goat's ribs, making a sound halfway between a hum and a word, in a language I don't speak. I think about $4, about what $4 can do, about the part of you that keeps growing in the direction of the sun, even when there is no sun. I never learned the Apache word for it. I've been looking for the English one ever since. I don't think it exists,